Hi, welcome back to the Introduction to Python Programming. We're moving on along to Section 2, Types and Variables. In this lesson, we're going to start to get our feet wet with some of the basic concepts in the Python programming language that allow us to build onto those more advanced concepts later. The lesson objectives for this video include understanding data objects, understanding variables, understanding names and labels, and then of course we have our commit location. That commit location is going to allow us to pull the resources related to this lesson, and we'll do that when we move into the lab environment. And within this commit, there's going to be questions and answer worksheets as well as a cheat sheet, just like there was in the previous lesson. So types, variables, and objects. Types define how Python will interpret your data. A number will be treated differently than a string. What is a string? It's simply a word or text, whereas a number is a number like 5, 3, or 4. Now, types allow Python to understand that it needs to treat that data differently. So if we take 5 plus 5, Python's going to understand that's going to equal 10. If we take the words hello and world and add those together, Python's going to understand that we need to say hello world and not actually add it like a number. Variables. Variables are labels for data objects. Data objects. Python creates a new data object for all immutable data types when set. So we're going to discuss that more and more as we move through the lesson. Data objects can contain types that are immutable and mutable. Mutable means you can change it. Immutable means you cannot change it. And variables are labels. So data objects could be like a container that contains data, and a variable is like a label that you stick onto that container so that you know what it is. And mutable. Changing data for a mutable object does not create a new data object. All right. So we have our different Python data types there, and we're going to discuss this more and more as we go along. So on this, we have our different Python data types, which is immutable data type and mutable data type. We can see that our immutable data types include numbers, strings, and tuples. So an integer is an example of a immutable data type. So if we have a variable a that points to integer 3, and then we change that value from 3 to 5, what Python's going to do in the background, it's going to create a new data object, set the value to 5, and point the a label to that data object. And if the previous data object, it's going to get a reference decrement to say from 1 to 0, and if no other labels point to that data object, Python is going to throw that away in a garbage collection process. So mutable data can be changed. Immutable data cannot be changed. Now this is reference to the data object. Okay, if you take an integer and you change the value of the variable again, Python's going to let you do that, but the way it does that is it creates a new data object in the background. So new objects. When an immutable object appears to have its data changed, Python creates a new data object with its value set to the new value. Now you might be thinking, well, if it's doing that and I don't really see that, why do I care about that? Well, you're going to pick up on why you're going to care about that as we move through this course, because when you get to those more complex data operations, it's very useful and sometimes mandatory to know how Python is treating those data objects. So variables. In the image, we have a variable a and a variable b that points to a data object that's an integer and has the value 7. Variables are just names and labels. Variables are not data objects. They lead to or point to the data object in memory. Now that's a key concept. You definitely want to get that down. A and B on the left are labels that point to the same data object. New data object. If we change the value of B, a new data object is created. Remember, the int type, which is a number, is immutable. All right. So in the variable example, we have a equal 5. Python creates a label and a data object. Python points the label to the data object. Okay. B equals a on line 3. Python creates a new label and points it to the same data object that a points to. So after line 3 executes, we have the graphic that we were looking at in the previous slide. And then a equals 7 on line 4. A new data object is created. Python points label a to the new data object. Let's move on. So the data object explained. Data objects are doing work for you. that you might otherwise need to worry about in more or different languages, such as C. In C, you're not going to have the concept of a data object unless you build a data object. So let's talk about these attributes of the data object. The ID allows Python to track different objects. When Python creates a data object, it gives it a unique ID so that it can keep track of that object and differentiate it between other objects with different IDs. The type. What can you do with the data? Strings are not numbers and support different operations. 5 plus 5 equals 10. Hello plus world equals hello world. And reference count. When multiple labels point to the same object, reference count increases. If we change what those variables point to, reference count decreases. If reference count hits 0, Python knows it can garbage collect on that object. And then the other attribute that's there is value. For example, if we have an integer data object with a value 7, well, that's the value of that object, 7. Now with that, let's go ahead and jump into our lab environment. We're going to pull the commit so we can get the course resources for this specific lesson. And we're also going to take a quick look at some examples and then also discuss the questions and answers related to this lesson. All right, here we are in the lab environment. Let's go ahead and check out the write commit because we can see that we have section 1 still there. That's not correct. So I'm going to open up that terminal window, which I still left open. I'm going to hit the up key, which shows me my last command I entered. I don't want to run that specific command. I want to change this number to the section 2 number. Now this is on the slideshow and it'll be in the video description as well. And of course you can just copy me here as well because it'll be the same. So B3B CBD. All right, look at that. Now we're at section 2. So I'm gonna go ahead and click into that folder. I'm gonna take a look at the cheat sheet. Oh, I got too many things open here. Let me go ahead and close all this stuff. This is from the previous lesson. Get that out of the way. Close browser. Let's reopen that. All right, there's the section 2 cheat sheet. And this just goes over some additional concepts that we discussed on the slideshow. So be sure to look at that. Now let's go into our let's take a look at our examples first. Example 1. We only have one example for this. So we'll go ahead and double click on it. It's going to open it with PyCharm Community. And we can see it's that same example that was in the slideshow. So let's go ahead and right click and run example 1. It runs, it prints 5, which is B is equal to A is equal to 5, so that's what we expect to see. And then if we wanted to just do a quick change, we of course can go and change that to A. We're going over very simple concepts here, nothing too bad at all. So run example 1, print out 7. Make sure that you do understand what little is going on here. We said A equal to 5. This is a variable. That creates a data object with the value 5. We set B equal to A, which does not create a new data object. B is going to point to the same data object that A is pointing to. And then A is actually going to create a new data object because integers are immutable. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at the exercises. So right now these are simple enough to where I can fit them in the video, but later on when we get to the intermediate to more advanced topics, they will get their own videos to go over the assignments and the answers. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up the questions. Task 1, what is the difference between mutable and immutable? Why is this important? Well, I don't even need to look at the answer here. I've been saying this all lesson. Mutable means the data can be changed without creating a new data object. Immutable means the data cannot be changed and a new data object must be created when that data is changed. And why is it important? It's important because you need to understand when Python is changing or adding data objects, or when you're changing the data object that has multiple variables pointing to it. When you change a mutable type, you could have variable A and B pointing to the same data object. And when you change that mutable type, variable B is going to change along with that because they both point to the same thing. And we'll see examples of that as we move on. What is the relationship between variables and data objects? Variables are labels. Data objects actually contain the values that the variables point to. So, and then task 3 says create 4 variables that create only 2 integer data objects. So how would we do that? Well, we can open up our PyCharm. Let's take a look at this. How many data objects create 4 variables that create only 2 data objects? Okay, so in here we have 2 variables. So we need more. So we'll say a equals 5, b equals 6. So we have 2 data objects at this point. And then we'll say c equals a and d equals b. Now this answers the question appropriately because we've created 4 variables that create only 2 integer objects. Now I didn't have to point d to b. I could have easily pointed it to a, and then we have 3 variables that point to the same data object, which would be a, c, and d. But just to evenly spread it, I went ahead and pointed it at b too. And then if there's any confusion on whether or not a program will run, that you have the correct syntax, just right click and select run example 1. And if it crashes, you have no errors and the program's working. I mean, if the program doesn't crash and you have no errors, then the program's working. So what was the last one? After the value of one data, alter the value of one data object from task 3. Ensure that you do not create a new data object. Well, that sounds a bit odd to me. I know that the integer is immutable, which means that if I change the value, I'm going to create a new data object, and there's nothing I can do about that. That's the way the Python engine works. So this is a trick question. I cannot actually alter the value of one data object from task 3. And I cannot ensure that I do not create a new data object. If I try to alter a value because they're immutable, a new data object is going to be created. So that finishes this lesson. Not too bad. We're moving on along. Let's go ahead and jump back to the slideshow and finish this lesson out. All right, here we are at the slideshow again. Let's go ahead and finish this out. We already discussed this slide. And section conclusion. We learned about variables. We learned about data objects. And we learned about mutable and immutable. And that finishes this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you in the next. Thank you.